Ladies and gentlemen, I have a huge announcement. I was wrong. That's right. I was wrong big time. It was something I tweeted out about a week or two ago, around the time where I got name warded tier 3, and I tweeted out the idea that, or the suggestion that for a CTP of Rage build on a character, if you have one equipped, you don't need to get both crit rate and dodge to 75%. You only need to get one of the two stats. And this was based on testing that I had done that seemed to fit the bill, and it was also based on testing that some of my Alliance members had done. But you know, if you've been following the CTP of Rage kind of information, disinformation for a while, and it's been pretty much since the CTP came out, they even adjusted the wording on the CTP. It used to say per 1% of dodge rate or crit rate. You know, there's been so many different iterations, and then on top of that, there's basically memes about the CTP of Rage because people online and Reddit and Discord have been messaging customer service, asking the customer service for Netmarble how the CTP of Rage calculates the damage and what works and what doesn't work, and they've been giving like 5 different answers. You know, you pick a day of the week and send them that question, and you'll get a different answer on every day of the week. So I do want to clarify. I was wrong. Absolutely, and I want to clarify what the actual real answers are, and I wasn't actually the person to even obtain the real answers for how the CTP of Rage is calculated. So, hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the channel, Cynicalex, and today I want to explain to you, with the help of Urs from Reddit, he's a Reddit mod, explain to you how best to build your characters if they're going to be equipped with the CTP of Rage, and it's different for each character that you have now, so you got to pay close attention. But before we get into that, I do need to shout out to 2 people here. First, we're going to shout out to Puppet Master. He's got a great little CTP of Rage testing video. You want to check this one out. I've seen it and it's good, and it gives you some insight into what builds work and what builds don't for the CTP of Rage. It's very, very thorough, and this person deserves more subscribers. Secondly, I want to huge shout out to the man who did it himself, Urs. He contacted Netmarble directly, and this is probably something that I should have done, but I didn't, and he got the answer directly from them. A special thank you to Marvel Future Fight team. We're not talking about customer service now, we're talking about the dev team that helped us, to share the information with you, us, the community. So what is the information that Urs was able to ascertain? Big round of applause for him. What was the information that he was able to ascertain? Well, basically, the CTP of Rage damage is based on both dodge and crit. So you do have to build up if you want the absolute highest stats. If you want to min-max your CTP of Rage builds, you have to get 75% dodge, or as close as possible, and as close as possible to 75% crit rate. And additionally, if you have a skill, this is the very important part, if you have a skill that increases the crit rate of your character, it is also calculated. So this was something that a lot of people in the community thought was completely wrong. A lot of people thought that skill buffs never applied to a CTP of Rage, whether that's a skill buff that gives you crit rate, which is very, very common, or it was a skill buff that gives you dodge, which is less common, but it still exists. Moreover, if you go over 75%, it's not calculated. So we already knew that. If, you know, going over cap by 5%, going over cap by 10% doesn't really matter. And then Urs just goes into more detail in terms of using numbers and using examples to give you what would happen if you had those stats maxed or not maxed. So huge, tremendous shout out to him. And I want to read this just for clarity here. Edit for people who believe every word YouTubers say without a source or questioning, but cannot believe this announcement. The information is coming from the developers. So yeah, 100%, I was wrong. This is correct. Now let's investigate this a little bit further, because additionally, on top of the fact that now you know that skill buffs work, you also want to take into consideration what you have available to you. So we're going to do a really quick test with Thanos, and then we're going to get into what you want to do for a CTP of Rage specifically. So in this case, my first test with Thanos, we're going to be going up with a build that has maxed out crit rate and maxed out dodge. So we're going to re-roll this one over to crit rate. I actually should have done this before the video, but whatever. And basically this is to illustrate that skills that apply a buff will calculate in and will factor into the score. So we're going in with a CTP of Rage. Of course, Thanos. This Thanos has max crit rate, max dodge, and then whatever, 168 crit damage, maxed out ignore defense, maxed out cooldown. We don't really care about the other stats. We just care about the crit rate, crit damage, and the dodge, okay? Additionally, you notice that the 4th gear is crit rate, and he's got a CTP of Rage. That's pretty much all you need to know. But for the future test of this build, for later testing, you're going to notice that on his third skill, he has a 25% crit rate buff for 7 seconds, and this is a skill that you can cast every 6.5 seconds. So you can keep up this 25% crit rate buff the entire fight. So theoretically, if Ursa's data is correct, and if the developers are right, which I know they're right, but I just want to prove it now once and for all, well, not once and for all, but, you know, do my unscientific testing here, you can actually have Thanos at 50% crit rate, and it will be the same. The very first couple of hits, if your skill rotation doesn't start off with 3, the very first couple of hits won't benefit from that extra buff for the CTP of Rage, but it's just the very first rotation. After that, you'll be fine. And so in that case, I should be able, theoretically, to drop my crit rate by switching this around to another stat, and I should be able to get the exact same or very similar result. So we're going to be going up against a stage 50 Cull Obsidian. I've done this testing quite a few times. We're going to bring along Wasp so I don't get snared, or most of the time I don't get snared. And we're bringing along Shuri just for some extra damage. None of these characters are going to strike for me, and I'm also not going to be using any strikers to manipulate or sort of, you know, affect the overall damage output. But basically, what we're going to do is we're doing this one with capped crit and capped crit rate and capped dodge, and then we're going to do it again with not capped crit rate, and we're not going to put that extra stat into any other, we're not going to put that extra 4th gear skill into any other beneficial stat. Now, a little aside before we get into before we get into the final results here, there is one thing to note. Now, even though the rotation, or sorry, even though the results of the CTP of Rage questioning dictate that you do need both crit rate and dodge maxed out, just, you know, it's a pretty common sense thing, but it begs repeating that having your crit rate maxed is technically going to do more for your damage than your dodge. Even though both dodge and crit rate will apply equally for the CTP of Rage's calculation, just the way that crit rate works. Crit rate boosts your attack by giving you more chances to crit. So, you know, having 75% dodge versus having 75% crit is different. You know, the crit does help more. So there we were able to get to about halfway down 14. This was a bit of a bad run. We're doing a 1-minute test here. I was able to get actually down to the very beginning of 13, so I was actually able to get about a half a bar more with my crit rate and my dodge maxed. But this is fine. But anyways, now we're going to remove the crit rate from his 4th gear, and theoretically we should see a drop in damage because this is a high enough stage 50, and I'm not doing that much damage. So a change like this where I'm losing, you know, what are we at right now? We're at 75%. We're overcapped by 1 point, so we're at 76.5 crit rate. And we're going to just switch this to any other stat as long as it's not crit damage. It doesn't matter. Attack speed doesn't actually increase our damage. It just increases our animation speed. We dropped down to 62%. So we lost almost 14% crit rate. And from the cap, we lost about 12.5% crit rate. That's enough. That should be enough to see at least a drop. You know, 12% crit rate is not a small amount. We're talking like, you know, 25%, 10 to 25, or 12.5. Anyways, we're talking like 10 to 12, maybe 15% of my crit rate gone. I don't really know what the math is. It's like 1/5 or 1/6. I guess 1/5 would be 20%, 1/6 would be 18%, but whatever. 15 to 18% of my crit is gone, crit rate. But yeah, going back to what I was saying about the difference between crit rate and dodge, although you technically do want both your crit rate and your dodge capped or as close to capped as possible for a CTP of Rage to get the maximum value for min-maxing purposes, you still need to take into consideration that crit rate is going to give you a larger return on your damage specifically. Now, if you are using a CTP of Rage for some reason in PvP, then obviously a dodge obelisk, or obviously the dodge stat will help you more than the crit rate. But it is worth mentioning that, you know, having the 75% crit rate and having whatever 65% dodge is more beneficial than the other way around. So I would still say, despite the fact that you want, and I've been interrupted twice going into my 5th skill, despite the fact that you do want both of them to be capped out, you definitely want to still prioritize crit rate because of the fact that crit rate does have a natural boost to your damage. So you can see here that we actually did more damage despite the fact that Cull Obsidian Guard broke us and interrupted our 5th skill twice. So I got interrupted twice and I did more damage. Now you can chalk that up to critting more, but I lowered my crit rate. And I didn't compensate my crit rate with more crit damage. I didn't change around my team. There's really almost no reason why I should have done more damage. There's nothing to amplify my damage on this run that couldn't have amplified it on the last run. You could say that I hit my procs better on this run, but honestly, it was as bad, if not worse, on top of the fact that I missed 2 5th skills, which the 5th skill does pretty decent energy damage. So this, I think, is a good enough confirmation of what Urs was saying. Now, I don't like doing this for the majority of the time when it comes to information. I do like finding it out for myself, but it is extremely hard. I will say this. It's extremely difficult to test in Marvel Future Fight, and it's extremely difficult to test when it comes to something like CTP of Rage because there are so many variables. There's your crit rate, there's the buff, the 0.9% buff. We don't even know how the buff technically interacts with the boss's damage decrease, ignoring the damage decrease. We don't know if it synergizes or not with ignore defense, which is another stat altogether, how much crit damage is helping, and all of these other factors. There's so many factors involved. So, for anybody out there who tested it out in the past and thought it was one way or thought it was another way, don't feel embarrassed, don't feel dumb. I was the dumb who tweeted out saying, oh, I tested it on my Captain Marvel, and you don't need to cap both skills, you only need to cap one of them. So yeah, that information is absolutely 100% correct. However, there is still an asterisk where you may not want to cap both crit rate and dodge. Now, in the case of someone like Thanos, because we now know that for Thanos' build specifically, you can count on Warlord Slash to be active the whole fight. So in a very similar way, if you have a CTP of Rage on Thor, and again, you might not, it's a pretty expensive CTP to put on a character who's not top tier for anything, but similarly for Thor, he has 25% crit rate for 10 seconds on his 4th skill. So if I could rearrange his setup here, I might do the same thing, and I might drop his crit rate well below 70% to 50% because I can keep this 25% up all the time. But specifically in the case of Thanos, what I can now do is I can take advantage of the fact that I don't need his 4th gear rolled to crit rate, and I can actually roll this to crit damage. And now I'm actually getting even more, way more out of my CTP of Rage overall. But there is still that asterisk that I wanted to discuss with you, and it's basically the balance between the 2 stats that you need for the CTP of Rage, which are crit damage and dodge, and then crit rate and dodge, and then crit damage, which crit damage is not a stat that you need for the CTP of Rage, but it is the stat that benefits from when you crit. And if you have very high crit rate, i.e. 75%, you're going to be landing a lot of critical attacks, and then it will take your crit damage stat. So in the case of explaining why there was a false positive, me thinking that you don't need to max dodge and crit rate for a CTP of Rage, the reason why I made that mistake is because I switched around Captain Marvel's setup, her Uru, her 4th gear, and her uniform effects, like her uniform bonuses. I switched those around and I gave her more crit damage. So you can see here I dropped her dodge, but I still have that 75% crit rate, and now I was able to max out her crit damage. This may be a better overall fit than sacrificing like 20% crit damage just to get that extra 20% dodge. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not 100% sure what's better. That's obviously something that you have to test, and it may be different for different characters, but that is something to keep in mind. We know how the CTP of Rage works now. It takes both stats, and it also takes into account skill buffs, but you don't want to sort of weaken or completely reduce your crit damage to the lowest possible amount just to get that crit rate and that dodge up for the CTP of Rage, because it may end up being the same. I'm not saying it will be, but I'm saying it could be. The difference between having, maxed out dodge and maxed out crit rate and low crit damage you could end up getting a similar score for ABX or a similar time in your World Boss Ultimate runs as if you maxed out crit rate, didn't max out your dodge, but then put those dodge points into crit damage. It's not always possible to do that, but particularly for characters who have it on their 4th gear. Originally, I had Captain Marvel's 4th gear rolled to dodge, I rolled it over to crit damage, and I actually found that I was doing higher scores, I was getting higher scores, and I was doing better for ABX specifically. So I do want to point that out. Just because we know the way that it works now, it doesn't mean that we should slavishly apply those ideas and completely ignore crit damage. It is more difficult to build a character with a CTP of Rage because you also need to take care of crit damage, and you don't get a lot of crit damage from, like, you don't really get crit damage buffs, you get crit rate buffs, so it's quite a bit harder. But it also is now quite a bit easier for characters who have crit rate buffs, in the case of someone like Thor or Thanos, because now you can use that crit rate and switch it over to crit damage. It kind of sucks that we're finding out about this now after the free Uru exchange is gone, but you know, I take responsibility for that. I should have you know, spearheaded talking to the devs specifically to figure that one out, and unfortunately I didn't. So apologies for anyone that I misinformed. I didn't do so on purpose. I genuinely thought that it wasn't the case, and a lot of people did as well, my Alliance members included, and we were kind of all sort of theory crafting that together. Thank you so much one more time to Urs for finding out the actual real buffs and how the interaction works between stats and the CTP of Rage. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Subscribe if you enjoy the content, you want to support me, and of course, if you like what you see, I hope to see you later today. Take care.